So, welcome everybody for this session. I'll be moderating this session. My name is Yasser Bahjatt. I'm an Arabian fiction author. Next to me on my left is Ibraheem Abbas. He is a best-selling author of the novel titled Behgت, and Dr. Moonda Smalls, who is also a best-selling Arabian fiction novelist. He's published 5 novels so far. I apologize for our 2 other colleagues who could not make it today. One had a personal issue and the other didn't get the visa in time. But amongst the 5 of us who should have been giving this talk, we sold more than about 500, maybe much more than 500,000 copies of fiction in a much smaller market than the rest of the world. So I think we should just jump in unless anything about yourselves before we start?
As Yasser said, I am Ibraheem Abbas. A few years back, I got into depression. And then my beloved wife was suggesting solutions every day. One day she comes and she says, why don't you take courses in violin? Why don't you start dancing tango? Why don't you write a novel? I'm not actually a tango person, so I felt that the easiest option was to get rid of that thing and write the damn novel. So 4 months later, I had my first novel, Behgت. I published it in the same time where Inferno, the Arabic version, came to market. And to my shock, Behgت was #1 by far, and #2 was Inferno. And then I got stuck. And then I thought it would have been much better to study the tango than writing novels. I wrote my second and third novels, and here I am.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Munthar Alkabbani. I'm by day a surgeon, by night I'm a writer, I guess. Well, my first novel was actually in 2006, called The Shadow Government, and this novel was actually self-published, because at that time I was virtually a nobody, an unknown writer. And nobody received, and I heard a few talks here about that same issue. Apparently it's not just in the Arab world, it's even here in Finland and other countries. And nobody would publish a virtual unknown, so I had to actually raise the money to publish for myself. I self-published, and I managed to raise the money, and I believed in my novel so much that I actually made 3,000 copies, which at that time, the publisher, or the publisher who was going to take my money and publish it, thought I was crazy. But I said to myself, you know what, if I'm going to start, might as well start big, you know, just do 3,000 copies, and maybe I'll try to find half of it friends and colleagues, and I'll just give it to them. And oddly enough, this novel was actually, I didn't actually have time to gift it. I actually gave 20 copies as a gift, because for whatever odd reason, the novel was, the 3,000 copies was sold out in a few months. And the rest was basically history, as they say. I mean, once you prove successful as a writer, even in the Arab world, publishers will just run after you. They will come and offer you all these incentives to publish for you. And since then, basically, I did not face any problems with publishers. And 5 novels later, I mean, luckily, my novels now are considered the best-selling novels in the Arab world. And actually, me and Ibraheem as well, he didn't mention that. 2 of my novels, or one of his novels, is being adapted into a movie or TV series by one of the biggest satellite channels in the Arab world, with a viewership 3 times of HBO, NBC. So I mean, so there is hope, I guess.
So what's really common is not, what's different in our part of the world than what normal writers face in the rest of the world is that science fiction and fiction genre, like before 2006, almost did not exist. So publishers, there was no publishers that published this kind of work. They assumed there was no audience for it, and so not only are you a new author, but you're in a genre that publishers believe doesn't have a client base. And I think that's an interesting starting point or an ending point for what we want to talk about. Is the journey of Arabian fiction. As you've seen, our title is 1001 Years Later, so it all starts with the 1001 Nights. And I think, again, Dr. Moonda, you're a much bigger expert than the both of us on the 1001 Nights. So.
Well, interestingly enough, I had a talk a few years ago, asked in Kuwait Book Fair, to talk about the history of crime novels in general. So partly because my novels have been, some of my novels have been labeled as crime thrillers, historical crime thrillers, especially the first two. So I looked it up and I researched the history of crime novels. And interestingly enough, most writers consider the first true crime story is a story that's been published in 1001. You're all familiar with 1001 Arabian Nights, right? Which was basically an anonymous collaborative work that was written almost 1,000 years ago, and it's basically a compilation of multiple stories, novellas, short stories, and novels under the premise of Shahrazad, the wife of the Sultan Shahryar, who's killing his wife because his first wife basically cheated on him, so he started marrying every day a new wife and killing her until Shahrazad came, and she managed to delay her beheading by telling Shahryar, her husband, a new story every night, and hence 1001 Nights. And yes, by the end of 1001, he doesn't kill her. He basically falls in love with her.
You just ruined the story.
Well, I asked you if you're familiar. You all said yes. That's why I asked if you're familiar.
If I may add, despite the difference in looks between us and Shahrazad, I'm sure that she's much prettier, but we feel more or less like her writers, right? Because we have to keep our audience on a cliffhanger every time, otherwise they will censor us.
Exactly. So the bottom line, to cut a long story short, something happened from 1,000 years ago until now, in that 1,000 year gap history, where basically Arabic fiction went into hibernation. 1001 Nights, as you all know, has profound influence over literature all over the world. As a matter of fact, just to give you a very simple example, Paulo Coelho's the famous novel, The Alchemist, which sold more than 50 million copies, which probably most of you read, is actually based on a snippet, a very short story in 1001 Nights. It's literally a paragraph in length. But Paulo Coelho was so influenced by that little story that he made his full novel, The Alchemist, from that little small snippet of a story. Just to give you just one simple example, not to mention other writers like Borges and Marquez and others who were profoundly influenced by Arabian Nights. But unfortunately, something happened in the Arab world where nothing, just 1001 Nights came, then total hibernation for 1,000 years, and then in 2000, and then in the early 20th century.
I think before we get into that, let's dig in a little bit deeper on the actual influence of 1001 Nights, because a lot of people know about the 1001 Nights, know some of the prominent stories, but maybe not everybody can clearly see all the influences that it actually has. So, Ibraheem, I think.
I just want to ask a question. Who knows that Sinbad, Ali Baba, Aladdin are all stories from the 1001 Nights? Oh, so you are. I didn't know that. I had to search. So it's. Hello?
Just use your phone.
Okay, then I'll just use my own amplifier. All the way to Christina Aguilera. If you wanna be with me, I can make you.
No, don't sing.
I can
The
make
sound
you
system is down, so.
come true. I am a genie in a bottle. Just rub me, Christina, the right way. So the influence went all the way to Christina Aguilera from the 1001 Nights. We'll just continue.
Yeah.
And it's not just the direct influence, it's the indirect influence. If you think of a voyage that explores new universes with all mysterious creatures, you might think Star Wars, and you might think Sinbad. You might think, what's his name, Han Solo. Han Solo, the lovable, adorable thief. The same way you think of Aladdin, the adorable thief. You think of the prince that saves the princess in all the Disney films, he's the same guy as Aladdin, the prince who's saving the princess. So the influence is not only the direct influence of so many films and literature and Japanese anime, it's also the indirect influence of all fiction.
So, but one other fault that most of the world has is, in Arabic, the collection is not called the 1001 Arabian Nights. It's called the 1001 Nights. And it's because it's really not Arabian. Yes, there are some Arabian stories in there, but it's really a collection of stories from all over the world where, to a huge extent, the Islamic Empire exists. So there are parts from India, from Persia, from North Africa, from even some, like from Iraq, all of these places, all of these different stories collected, okay, into this one single work of art. And whoever did this tried to weave them together by the overlaying story of Shahryar and Shahrazad. So what's really interesting about that is, where did this come from? And why did it have all of this influence that lasted for so long? And we believe that a huge part of it is because the Arabian world at that time was a melting pot of cultures that came together and interacted with each other. That's why with this melting pot and all of this interaction, this work of fiction that lasted for centuries existed. And back to your question of why it fell all together, why did it stop? I think it was related to conservative people who suddenly decided, you know what, we want to look back to the past. The past was an amazing place, and once you start looking to the past, you stop moving forward.
Yes, and interestingly enough, fiction became more or less the profession of simple charlatans or simple storytellers, but it's not something that intellectuals would want to do. And that remained for that period of 1,000 years until the early 20th century, and specifically in around 1918, 1917 in Egypt, where a novel came out, which was called Zainab. Zainab is the name of the main character of the novel, and she's a little Egyptian farm girl. Now, the author of that novel, because at that time fiction is not something that is regarded as something that someone intellectual would write or someone from a high social standing would write, he did not put his name on it. So it was published as an anonymous novel. Well, that didn't last for long, because the novel, that Zainab, was so successful, so hugely successful. Well, for one thing, it's been dubbed as the first true Arabic novel, and people were just crazy for more, that the writer came out and said, you know what, it's actually me, I'm the one who wrote it. And it was a guy the whole sound system. I think it's the curse of 1001 Nights.
And the genie in the room.
Yeah. If there is a genie in the room, if there is a genie, please, can you? Anyway, so, but you guys can hear me in the back.
With Ibraheem. He's the guy with genie.
Right? I mean, in the back, shame, you can hear me, right? From Game of Thrones, you can hear me.
Can you kick the genie out? Shame him out.
You know, that Cersei Lannister walk. You know. Anyways. So going back to Zainab, so the author came, and he was none other than a very famous intellectual from a very prominent Egyptian family. His name is Muhammad Hussein Haykel. And he said, this is my novel, I'm the one who wrote it. And that really opened the door towards literature, fiction as a whole. And then other writers started looking into that area of literature, writing novels. But the problem for 80 years, for the next 80 years, basically until roughly the beginning of the 21st century, if you go to any bookstore or library, you'd be faced with two main genres of Arabic fiction. The romantic novel, spearheaded by two very famous Egyptian writers, Ihsan Abd al-Quddus and Yusuf al-Sabai, or the social novel, the social
drama.
Yeah, exactly, realism, social realism, spearheaded by the famous Najib Mahfouz, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1988. So these are basically the two genres, and most of the writers fall either under that kind of social realism with similar to Najib Mahfouz's writings, like Jamal Ghitani, Yusuf al-Qaid, and others, or under the genre of romantic novels. And it stayed like that until basically the 21st century, and specifically 15 years ago.
I think it lasted a while until the...
There were snippets, you're right. There were novels, writers like Nabil Farouk,
but
Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, who would write every now and then, but there wasn't a real form genre.
There wasn't a movement of science fiction or fantasy genre. But you just mentioned Nabil Farouk and Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq. Nabil Farouk, to a huge extent, I would consider him like the godfather of contemporary Arabian fantasy and fiction, because I mean, we were all of us, including the two other authors, were lucky enough to be born in the 70s, and then in the late 80s, this guy started publishing his science fiction novels, or novelettes, very small snippets, but like a whole series of 100, 150 very small stories. But that was, we all consumed them like crazy, and I think that influenced to a huge extent what you're talking about 15 years ago at the beginning of the century, when we started writing the next level of bigger novels, deeper fiction.
You know, I think I agree with you. We are the extremely lucky generation, because we caught the era when people were still reading, before the internet era and the TV era. So we had our chance where we have nothing else to do but reading those novellas. And we also caught the new era, the digital era. So after reading a lot, knowing how to write words, then we had the internet to search and write novels and spread it across many. So we are lucky. But back to the key question: why the hibernation for 1,000 years, and then the smaller hibernation for 80 years or so to start getting into fiction again? Politics. It takes one open-minded leader to change a whole nation, and that was Harun AlRashid, who was actually one of the characters in the 1001 Nights. A very open-minded guy. He brought every culture together, and that 9th century was the golden era of all the Arabian and Islamic bragging until today. All the scientific, artistic, cultural, and fictional boom was in his days and the days of his successor, Mamun.
So,
we have to shout, that's what he said.
okay, that's okay. Everybody in the back here as well?
Yeah, even.
Yeah, whenever you don't hear us, just ring the bell.
Shameless. So, I guess because of all of this, right now, what happened, especially as we said, in the beginning of the century, when mainly, in my opinion, the really first real fantasy / science fiction novels were Dr. Moonda's novels. They really started the movement. But now, I mean, even those social and romance novels, when we talk to publishers, they would say, well, a good Arabian novel would sell about 3,000, 4,000 copies in its entire lifetime, which is about 2 to 3 years. So the fact that his first novel, he printed 3,000, that's why the print house was telling him, you're an idiot. Nobody sells those many, so you're gonna, even if you're a successful one, you're gonna have to keep it storage for 3 years. The fact that he sold out in a couple of months or 3 months, okay?
I thought I had 3,000 friends, but apparently.
So, and that just showed that the new generation, the younger generation, are now really thirsty for this content. Like, they see this kind of content in American or English medium, but they are thirsty to see it in their own languages. And I guess that's another reason why we're the lucky generation, that we're lucky to get all of this knowledge and experience and content that we had when we were young with one-of-a-kind guy, and then we were lucky enough that when we started publishing, we had a generation that was really thirsty to see our work. I mean, one other thing, like, it has never been done that a feature film of a science fiction or a fantasy feature film is being produced. Right now, we're working on a feature film for Ibraheem Abbas on his first novel. As Moonda said, one of the major TV channel in the Middle East is now starting to invest in producing TV shows based on our works. And this has not been heard of before. anymore. If we would have went 15 years ago to this channel and asked them to invest in, and they wouldn't invest the time to listen to what we've got to say.
And it's not only that. There is no existing sci-fi feature film or Arabian series in the Arab world, not yet. So we are like back in 1920 when Zainab first came out. This is the first time when the Arab world starts watching Arabic science fiction movies. A few years back, we'd go and we would never find an Arabic sci-fi novel. Today, 9 or 8 out of the top-selling novels are actually fiction and science fiction, and mostly from the 5 of us.
If you search on Twitter or any of the social media for book recommendations, you would not find a single post that does not have at least one of our 5 books. And usually, if you found one of our books in the recommendation list, you're going to find one of us again in the same recommendation list, which is, I mean, to us, it's, first of all, we didn't know each other. Only me and Ibraheem worked together. Mundir, Osama, and Abdul Wahab. We just got together almost last month, and we decided to start working together to push forward this new wave of Arabian fiction. And I think that's kind of terrifying publishers and producers.
Well, in 2005, I mean, that's probably one of the things I wanted. You're probably asking me why did I actually go ahead and was I crazy enough to go publish 3,000 at my own expense? Actually, it wasn't as crazy as it might sound, because one of the things that I did my homework. One of the things I realized is that the Arab world is compromised mainly. I mean, if you look at statistics, pure statistics, 60% of the population in Saudi Arabia and probably most of the Arab world is under the age of 30. So you have a huge age group there who are not being catered to. When I thought about writing, one of the things that came to my mind is that I want to cater to this age group. I want to give them something which is exciting to read, something that's a page turner, but at the same time something that provides them with a good piece of literature. I mean, literature in my mind, it is not necessarily those of social realism or so, but you can have a good piece of writing in the form of science fiction, or I mean, Arthur C. Clarke was an example for me, and also Umberto Eco, the famous Italian writer, in his famous novel The Name of the Rose and Foucault's Pendulum, was another example in my mind. In my mind, Umberto Eco is the creator of the genre of intellectual thrillers. I mean, where you have a thriller, but at the same time it's quite intellectual. I mean, you're not just reading a page turner, and at the end of the day, you're not getting anything out of it. But no, you're reading something, and you're also it's constantly raising questions, constantly making you think, constantly making you wonder. And I wanted to write something like that. I wanted to write something which is a page turner. But at the same time, the relationship of the reader with the novel does not end with the last page. No, I wanted the relationship to continue even after finishing reading that book, in the form of questions and research and raising questions that they want to go and seek the answers to. And this is what I did with my first novel. At least that's what I tried to do. And my calculation apparently was correct, and that yes, there was an audience for that kind of novel. And the success of that novel, that first novel, The Shadow Government, in 2000, which was published in 2006, I mean, luckily, it opened a big door towards other writers who share that same enthusiasm, like Ibraheem, like Yasser, like my 2 invisible colleagues that you don't see here. And it opened a door, and I think that's something, which in itself, I think, makes me quite proud, in that not only did I write 5 successful novels in Arabic literature, but the fact that I managed to open this door for others also to come and utilize in order to further reach the youth who are not being catered to until the beginning of the 21st century.
So, almost everybody here kind of got the gist of what was Arabian fiction when we were talking 1001. So, how do you see what defines Arabian fiction now, and how it will move forward?
Yeah, I think nowadays we have got an even bigger melting pot than what happened back in the 9th century. Today we have got the seeds from all around the world, and the seeds are coming to us through YouTube. But we stopped exporting our own seeds. People don't know our culture. How is the Arabic world and Arabic culture after Sinbad and Alibaba and Aladdin? There's one thing that we really look forward blending with the existing other seeds and exporting to the rest of the world as fresh, interesting, exciting content. And it's not only the Arabic culture. I'm sure that there are so many other dark spots on the globe that deserve this movement and this chance. I am as interested as I am in the Arabic culture or American culture or Japanese culture to see the culture of Burkina Faso, for example. I am sure they have got lots of beautiful seeds that didn't get the chance to come to us. So the movement is not only about our culture, the movement is about any culture that was in hibernation for years or for eternity so far.
So the way I see it, I mean, I get this, sometimes I get this question, so we're already getting American fiction, or if I was in the US, we already have our own fiction, so why should we care about whether fiction from Burkina Faso, from the Arabian world, from India starts growing or starts exporting? And some people think it's just about the additional entertainment value of seeing something new. But the way I look at it, I'm an engineer and I'm sort of a scientist and a futurist, and the way I look at it is this universe is like this huge dark place where we exist. And it's like this huge desert, huge dark desert. There's no moon tonight. And then we're all lost in this desert. And suddenly one of us realizes, you know what? I forgot I had a flashlight in my pocket. And then when this person turns on the flashlight towards whatever direction and that desert is, how many of us do you think is going to be walking the other way? Like, the other way might be the best way to walk, but since this is the only way that has light shining on it, then there's only one path we can walk on. And that flashlight to me is the science fiction of any culture. So the more cultures start pulling out their flashlights and turning it on, the more possibilities humanity has to walk forward. And so to a huge extent, that's what got me into science fiction in the first place. That I have the theory that science fiction is the main driver for all human development and scientific development. And actually, me and Ibraheem, we started getting into science fiction in our company to prove this theory right. We said, okay, you know what? I'm in a part of the world that almost has no scientific development and almost has no science fiction published. What if I jumpstart the science fiction culture and see if scientific development follows? So
that will take us 20 years.
We're what, 4 years in, so we have 16 more years to come back and report to you. Whether it turned out that what I'm saying is right or wrong, but in any case, I think it's a very interesting way of looking at it. So. Unless anyone has something else to add, should I open up the floor for questions?
Just add one small thing to keep in mind: the challenges when you go to any culture. I'm sure that if you take half the novels that are published in 2017 back to, let's say, 1982, most of them will be banned and censored, right? For your own knowledge, the Arabian Nights are still banned in Arabia. The original version is not allowed.
So that's a 1,001-year ban.
It's considered too sexual. On the lines of the other challenges that we face before probably we open up for the discussion, is that, like probably I heard here from a number of talks, translation. Unfortunately, in the Arab world, there is a scarcity of translators, and that's probably one of the main reasons why a lot of people around the world have not read a lot of literature, Arabic literature, maybe a select few, but not a whole lot. It certainly does not represent what's out there, because what's out there is really quite unique and vast, and because we're talking 22 countries. We're talking about a world that stretches from the Arabian Gulf. Of course, if there was someone here from Iran, he would say the Persian Gulf. So it's
from Persia?
Yeah, from all the way from the whatever Gulf you want to call it, Arabian/Persian, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. That spans 22 countries. So you can imagine the wide variety of cultures that in these countries, the many voices, the many writers, and frankly, I mean, I read in English and I read in Arabic. I'm bilingual, and And I read a lot of translated work, and I can honestly say that I've read some of the best fiction in Arabic by Arab authors, but unfortunately a lot of it hasn't been translated. And that is a pity. And one of the reasons is that for some odd reason the world has lost interest in Arabic fiction. And hopefully that's one of the things that we in our group are trying to change, and that is to reinstate the interest again in Arabic fiction. But that is one of the main challenges, and that is how do we get our work and the work of others, other writers, not necessarily just us, introduce it to the rest of the world so that they can appreciate what we appreciate by various other authors.
So on that note, before I open for questions, so I wouldn't forget, you can actually download my novels, me and Ibraheem, translated on Kindle, and you can find the links on cards on the table over there. So as you come out, you can pick up a card from each one of these novels and get it for free today and tomorrow. And I guess we're open up for questions. Yes?
Yeah, so I have a question about the publishing environment. Can you discuss a little bit how it is in different countries? For example, you mentioned censorship, which is of course quite strong in Saudi Arabia. Can you, for example, talk about the situation in Lebanon and Jordan, and whether, like, is there a different literary scene there?
Well, first of all, most Arabian publishers use, like a lot of the major Arabian publishers are based either in Cairo or in Beirut, so either in Lebanon or Egypt. There are some few new big publishers in Saudi or in UAE, but the major, really big major publishing houses are either in Cairo or in Beirut. And they are to a huge extent the heart of Arabian literature and knowledge. So there really isn't much difference between publishing in the different parts of Arabia, because mainly these publishers operate to a huge extent in most of these 22 countries.
What's interesting in the Arab world, it's a bit different from the West, and probably a bit different from Finland here. We don't have agents. You know, in the West, or even probably in East Asia, if you're a writer, first thing you do is you go to an agent. You go to an agent, and that agent would represent you with the publishing house. We don't have agents in the Arab world. Basically, the author deals with the publisher directly, which is one big problem. The other problem is that most publishing houses, unless you're just similar to what I told you in the beginning with my example, unless you are a certified seller, even if you write the greatest novel, unless you're a certified seller, they can guarantee that your book would sell. They would simply say, you know what, you want to publish it, you have to pay for it. And then if you prove that you're a seller, that you sell books, then at that time they would say, okay, you know what, fine, you proved yourself, then we'll publish your books at our expense. And that's another problem. The third problem is the notion of marketing in Arab publishing houses is virtually non-existent. I mean, the three of us, probably because I'm the oldest of the three, even though I look younger. But the three of us, we actually self-promoted our own novels. That's how we became, because we used social media, we used social networking and so forth. We cater to the young generation. We managed to, this is how we managed to sell that number of books. Because that's not the norm in Arabic fiction. I mean, the norm is like, yes, I mentioned, a few hundred copies, 3,000 maybe over 5 years if you're lucky. So these numbers are in a way unprecedented, because part of it is because we managed to tap into that social media, the youth and so forth, and that helped out to a great deal. Now that's something that we do, and as you, some of you, we have some writers here, if we do, I mean, you know what it is like to waste your time doing publicity for yourself instead of writing. Because at the end of the day, as a writer, I want to write. I don't want to spend my whole time publicizing my work and being my own marketing manager. That's not what I do. What I do is I write. So that took part of our writing time, but the reward was great. And the other thing is that we didn't have any alternative. We didn't have any other choice. So that's another thing that a hurdle that we faced with publishing houses in America.
When I did my first novel, I sent it to every single publishing house I could reach to. Only one replied back out of the 5 or 6, humbly saying, "Who are you?" So that, luckily enough, that's what happened, and that's what pushed me and Yasser to establish our own publishing house and publish on our own, selling hundreds of thousands of copies every year, and getting billions of pirated free downloads online. Of Of course, I wish we could sell all of that. Wouldn't have been here. I would have stopped writing and took my tango courses. But,
You're too short. Okay.
In a world which does stretch over such a range of countries and cultures, do you find there's a different reception across the Arab world to your work?
I'll talk about our novels, me and Ibraheem. The reception was almost everywhere similar. Of course, because we're a small publishing house, our distribution reach was not similar. But we found through online that we have fans in almost every one of these 22 countries, and the feedback we're getting from them is almost consistent.
My publisher is one of the biggest publishing houses in the Arab world, Arab Scientific Publishers. They actually, a couple of years ago, they won one of the biggest prizes in the Arab world, Sheikh Zayed Prize for Publishing, which is roughly a $250,000 award. So it's a big publishing house, and they have reach all over the world. Interestingly enough, they don't send to certain countries, like they don't send to Algeria, they don't send to Tunisia, they don't send to Morocco. And even though I have readers there, and mostly it's from pirated books, from PDF files. So, and I have a lot of my fans, they contact me saying, why aren't your books there? Because they want to buy my books. They feel guilty, I guess, reading the PDF copies. So when I asked my publishing, my publisher, and even though he's the biggest publisher, and that gives you an idea, also answers your question, I mean, another facet to your question. One of the reasons is because there isn't copyrights. They're afraid that they might send their books and they would never get the money for it. They would never get the selling rights for it. It's just too much of a hassle. Distribution is so much of a hassle because we don't have major distribution houses where they take the books and they would be responsible for making sure that the books went to the certain libraries and they're sold, and once they're sold you get the money. To them it's just too much of a hassle that they want to concentrate on just the Middle East, and that's it. And they know, and the rest of the Arab world, like in North Africa, well then they can just I don't want to use the word, but but you get the idea, right?
I know that in English there's been a small wave of book taking place in the Arabic world, or fantasy versions, like Saladin Ahmed's Journey to the Crescent Moon, or Rebel of the Sands by Alwyn Hamilton, and also others of the types I can't remember. Has there been any interest from US publishers in books written by Arab authors living in those countries, translated?
Translated into Arabic? You mean?
No, into English.
So Saladin has wrote in English.
Has the English-speaking publishing world tried to find works to translate into English?
I think it's still. They still think that we're still in dark ages and there isn't that much content coming out, but I think that's changing. But right now, this is my 4th WorldCon, and I'm starting to build connections, and we are starting to get inquiries. But usually what we're used to in the market is the other way around. So there's a lot of, there's not even much science fiction being translated from English to Arabic to start with. Except the very few that turn into feature films or something like that suddenly somebody's interested in translating, but there is no mainstream translation of fiction into Arabic. I'll keep jumping right and left, so sorry. Go ahead.
Would any of you perhaps like to tell us a little bit of one of your novels?
Okay,
about what it's
I guess
about?
each one of us can have a couple of minutes talking about one of his novels.
Yeah. When my wife asked me to write a novel, I went the lazy.
So the question is, can you please give us a brief on each one of you on one of your novels? So.
When my wife asked me to write a novel, I was too lazy to think of something original. I said, it's a love story, but I do like science fiction. And I do believe in ghosts, so I brought everything together. It's a romance, thriller, sci-fi, whereby a jinn, and by the way, jinn is not ghost, to Arabs, and that's another thing that has to do with culture. It's just a parallel universe. They have their own culture, and they don't wake up every morning and put the white fabric on and just say blue to us. So it is a romance story between a jinn that crossed his dimension to the human dimension and fell in love with a human girl.
So what's the science fiction part of it?
It's the dimensions, the multi-dimension.
How do we explain? Because the jinn is a religious part. Okay, so religiously we believe in their existence. So most people would look at it as fantasy or fact. But what Ibraheem tried to do is how to scientifically justify the existence of these beings and how they can interact with us.
I'll tell you about my last 3 novels. It's a trilogy. It's called the Knights and Priests trilogy. Knights and Priests. And it's basically about a guy who lives in modern Saudi Arabia. He's a plastic surgeon who basically starts questioning his reality around him. So he notices that the Arab Spring never took place. He doesn't even know what the Arab Spring, but there is some sort of vague, hint that the actual events that happen around him is not what he remembers happened, and even the people interacting with him. And then through certain circumstances, he finds himself way back 800 years in the past, at the era where the Mongol invasion started over the Islamic world. And then he starts questioning his reality and why is he been transformed back into history, and how is that related to the fact that his life has changed and his modern time day-to-day living is not what he recalls. And then to answer your question, what is the science fiction element in it? Well, in that novel, that novel basically has more than it's really more than one genre in that novel. And, this novel deals with a lot of mysticism, a lot of Islamic mysticism, cultural mysticism, and it tries to present a scientific explanation to mysticism, and that's the science fiction-y part in it. And that there is some, it draws some parallels from quantum theory mechanics and superstring theory and so forth, and it tries to explain mysticism. So what if what we think is pure mysticism? What if it is basically a form of a science that hasn't been discovered yet? And it draws from Arthur C. Clarke's, not exactly, but in a way, one of the reasons why I thought that novel is Arthur C. Clarke's famous saying, any sufficiently advanced civilization, its technology will appear to us as magic. So I took that idea and I basically played on it, but instead of UFOs and people from far space, I said, well, what if those mystics and those and with their supernatural abilities, what if there's a scientific explanation to it? And anyways, that's part of this. That's the science fiction element. But the novel itself, the trilogy, covers a lot of genres and a lot of themes. So difficult to explain in a few minutes.
So my novel is an alternate history. It's the first known alternate history novel in Arabic. And so alternate history in general is usually considered science fiction, but what's even deeper science fiction about it is I try to tap into some philosophical questions, whether is science an absolute truth or is it dependent on culture? Does historical event change what science is? So in this the alternate history is based on by changing the realities of what happened after the Spanish Inquisition and after the fall of Granada and Andalus. And I tried to explore what kind of different technological paths we could have taken and what kind of different ways of developing technology could have happened if this historical path was changed. I think we have enough time. Yeah, I think we have enough time for one more question.
I don't want to open a hornet's nest, but could you speak about women Arabic authors? Do they exist? And if they do they have any additional challenges? I know now.
I think Ibraheem knows one of them better than I do, so I'll give that.
Yeah, as Mundir said, it was only about romance and realism drama until recently. Fiction is more of a masculine genre in general, worldwide. So to find a lady in Saudi Arabia who's interested to start with in science fiction and who has the passion and capability to write in sci-fi
and the financial power
to publish it, that's rare, but they are coming. A friend of mine, she's a doctor also, and she's writing medical sci-fi. So far she has 2 published novels, very good sales, and she will join our group later on when we expand. So yeah, they are coming, and they're coming fast enough.
But there is prominent female authors, and just let me give you an example. There is a famous Saudi author. Her name is Raja. She is the first female in the Arab world to win the International Prize for Arabic Fiction, which is equivalent to the Booker Man Prize in the Arab world. She actually is the first female and the only one so far, and she's a Saudi Arabian. Her name is Raja Alim, and she's a prominent author. And there are other names. There are other names like Ibraheem mentioned, and exactly. So yes, they're not a lot. There are certainly, I mean, a few, but they are there, and they're certainly making their voice prominent, and they're succeeding. I mean, I just gave you an example of winning one of the most prestigious awards in the Arab world.
So I think that's a wrap up. Thank you all for showing up.
On the table.
The fandom still is not fully existing. Like we have hardcore fans, but not so the culture. But we like Ibraheem Abbas' novel was the first Arabic novel where people started